Blood thinned as James recognized her face. His surgical hands trembled for the first time in decades. The young woman he'd just pulled from death's grasp wasn't just any patient. Grace's eyes reflected his own. "Single dad doctor saves life," would read tomorrow's hospital newsletter, omitting the devastating truth. This stranger was his daughter, his blood, his secret. Her pulse beneath his fingers became unbearably personal. James Grayson moved with practiced precision through the bustling emergency room of Chicago Memorial, his white coat a beacon in the controlled chaos that had become as familiar to him as breathing. 53 years had etched fine lines around his eyes, but they had also gifted him with the steady hands and calm demeanor that made him one of the hospital's most respected trauma surgeons. Tonight was supposed to be like any other Friday night shift. Gunshot wounds, car accidents, the occasional heart attack, all part of the rhythm that had defined his existence since medical school. He had long ago mastered the art of professional detachment, of saving lives without letting those lives seep into the carefully constructed walls around his heart. Walls that protected the fragile balance between his demanding career and his role as a single father to his teenage son. The double doors to the ambulance bay burst open, flooding the sterile white hallway with the harsh glare of emergency lights and the frantic energy of paramedics moving with urgent purpose. Female, mid-20s, major trauma from high-speed collision, BP dropping, suspected internal bleeding, called out the lead paramedic, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to condensing human catastrophe into clinical data points. James stepped forward immediately, his mind already shifting into the focused state that allowed him to think clearly in crisis. The gurney rushed past him, and he caught only a glimpse of the young woman. Pale skin made alabaster by blood loss, dark hair matted with crimson, features slack in unconsciousness, before she was wheeled into Trauma Room 1, where life and death negotiations happened under harsh fluorescent lighting. Something about her face triggered a distant echo in his memory, like a half-forgotten dream trying to surface, but he pushed the thought aside as he followed the team into the trauma room. There was no time for distractions when seconds meant the difference between life and death. "Get me 2 large-bore IVs, cross and type for 4 units, and prep an OR immediately," he commanded, his voice carrying the quiet authority that came from decades of making decisions with lives hanging in the balance. His hands moved with precise efficiency, palpating the abdomen where a dangerous rigidity indicated massive internal bleeding, checking pupils for responsiveness, assessing the myriad injuries that threatened to steal this young life away before it had properly begun. The monitors beeped with increasing urgency as her blood pressure continued to drop, the electronic symphony of impending crisis that James had learned to interpret as clearly as reading sheet music. Nurses moved around him in a coordinated dance, anticipating his needs without being told, the product of countless shared emergencies that had forged an unspoken language between them. "She's crashing," announced the resident beside him, his young face tight with the strain of witnessing human fragility up close. James nodded, maintaining his composure even as the situation deteriorated. "Push another round of EPI and get her up to OR3 now. I'll scrub in immediately." His voice remained steady, betraying none of the adrenaline surging through his system. This was the moment when everything else fell away, personal worries, administrative headaches, even his own physical exhaustion, and there was only the pure, focused intention of saving this one life right now, with everything he knew and everything he could do. As they rushed the gurney toward the elevator, the young woman's hand fell limply from beneath the blanket, revealing a small tattoo on her inner wrist. A delicate compass rose, its needle pointing north. James felt an inexplicable chill run through him as the elevator doors closed, separating him momentarily from his patient while he took the stairs 2 at a time, his mind already mapping out the surgical procedure ahead. He couldn't afford to ponder why that small tattoo seemed to reach into his chest and squeeze his heart with cold fingers. or why this particular patient, one of thousands he had treated over the years, was triggering an unusual emotional response. Later, perhaps, he would examine these questions, but now there was only the urgent need to reach the operating room in time to stop the bleeding before it stole away all possibility of answers. Hours later, James stood at the scrub sink, methodically washing blood from his hands, her blood, while his mind replayed the surgery. It had been close, dangerously so, with moments when he thought she might slip away despite everything modern medicine could offer. But in the end, skill and perhaps a touch of luck had prevailed. The young woman would live, though her recovery would be long and painful. He should have felt only the professional satisfaction of a job well done, the quiet pride in having met death at the door, and turned it away. Instead, an inexplicable unease lingered, a sense that something fundamental had shifted in the universe while he had been focused on tying off bleeders and repairing damaged organs. Behind him, the OR team was finishing up, preparing to transfer the patient to recovery, their quiet efficiency a testament to the routine nature of what they had just accomplished together, routine for them, life-altering for the unconscious woman on the table. The soft beeping of monitors created a hypnotic rhythm in the ICU as James reviewed the chart of the young woman he had saved 12 hours earlier. Grace Williams, age 25, emergency contact listed as maternal grandmother, no known allergies. The clinical details were sparse, painting the outline of a person without capturing their essence, the way medical records always did. Outside the glass walls of her room, life in the hospital continued its relentless pace, nurses checking vital signs, residents making rounds, families hovering anxiously beside beds of loved ones. But inside this room, time seemed suspended in the space between heartbeats, as if waiting for something significant to occur. James had no reason to be here. The post-surgical care would be handled by the ICU team, and he had other patients requiring his attention. Yet he found himself drawn back to this room, to this patient, unable to shake the feeling that he was missing something important. Her face, cleaned now of blood and less pale than before, stirred that same elusive memory. Something about the curve of her cheekbone, the shape of her brow, familiar in a way that made no sense. James prided himself on his focused objectivity, his ability to separate the personal from the professional, but he found himself studying her features with an intensity that went beyond medical assessment. The resident who had assisted in surgery, Dr. Chen, entered the room quietly, startling James from his reverie. "Her labs are looking better, Dr. Grayson. The transfusions have stabilized her hemoglobin." Chen's voice was professional, betraying no curiosity about why the senior surgeon was standing so still beside this particular patient's bed, though James could sense the unasked question hovering in the air between them. He nodded, maintaining his composure through years of practiced self-discipline. "Good. Keep a close eye on her renal function. That left kidney took a significant hit." Chen made a note in the electronic chart and hesitated before adding, "We found something interesting in her personal effects. She had a letter addressed to Chicago Memorial, specifically mentioning the surgical department. Seems like she might have been coming here deliberately when the accident happened." The younger doctor's words hung in the air, a puzzle piece that made no sense on its own, but somehow intensified James's growing sense of unease. Why would this young woman have been carrying a letter addressed to his hospital, to his department? Was she a medical student seeking an interview? A patient with a complicated case seeking specialized care? None of these explanations seemed to fully account for the strange pull he felt toward her, or the way her presence had disturbed his usually impenetrable professional demeanor. "Where is this letter now?" he asked, keeping his voice deliberately casual. The mystery of the letter nagged at James as he moved through the remainder of his shift, consulting on surgical cases, reviewing post-op notes, and mentoring residents through their learning curve of life and death decisions. His life at the hospital had a comfortable predictability to it. The respect of colleagues, the gratitude of patients, the satisfaction of tangible results from his skill and knowledge. It was the sanctuary he had built for himself after his wife's death 8 years ago, a place where he could be useful and needed in ways that made sense to him. Home was different, quieter, filled with the emotional complexities of raising a son alone, navigating the terrain of adolescence without a map. He checked his watch, calculating whether he had time to call home before his next consultation. His son would be finishing homework now, probably sprawled across the living room couch with textbooks and snacks scattered around him in organized chaos. The memory of his late wife, Catherine, flitted through his mind, her laugh, her steady presence, the way she had anchored their family with quiet strength until cancer had stolen her away, piece by piece. He wondered, as he often did, what advice she would offer him now, how she would interpret the strange unease that had followed him from the trauma room. Catherine had always been better at reading emotional undercurrents, at sensing the human stories behind medical conditions. In the years since her death, James had thrown himself into work with increased dedication, as if surgical precision could somehow compensate for the messy emotional terrain he now had to navigate alone. His pager broke into these thoughts, summoning him back to the present moment with its insistent beeping. The ICU was calling about Grace Williams. She was waking up, becoming agitated, and asking for him specifically. By the time James reached the ICU, Grace was fully conscious, her eyes a startling shade of deep blue that triggered another jolt of uncomfortable recognition, focused intently on the door as if she had been waiting for him specifically. The nurse beside her bed looked relieved to see him. "She's been asking for you by name, Dr. Grayson. Wouldn't calm down until we promised to call you." James approached the bed with practiced professional courtesy, though his heart was beating faster than usual, an internal warning system responding to danger he couldn't yet identify. "Ms. Williams, I'm Dr. Grayson. I performed your surgery last night. You're in the ICU at Chicago Memorial. You've been in a serious accident, but you're stable now." His voice maintained its clinical detachment, the tone he had perfected over years of delivering news both good and bad to vulnerable patients. Grace's gaze never wavered from his face, studying him with an intensity that seemed to look past his professional facade into something deeper. When she finally spoke, her voice was raspy from intubation, but clear enough to carry the weight of her words across the small space between them. "I know who you are. I've been looking for you for a very long time." The simple sentence landed like a physical blow, forcing James to grip the railing of the hospital bed to steady himself. There was something in her tone, in the deliberate way she emphasized who you are rather than what you are, that sent a chill of premonition down his spine. Before he could formulate a response, she continued, each word measured and deliberate despite her weakened state. "My name is Grace Williams. My mother was Rebecca Williams, and according to every record I've been able to find, you are my biological father." The world tilted beneath James's feet, reality shifting like tectonic plates to accommodate this new information that couldn't possibly be true, and yet resonated with a terrible certainty in his bones. Rebecca Williams. The name unlocked a flood of memories he had carefully packed away decades ago, from before his life with Catherine, before the stability and purpose he had built for himself. A brief relationship during his medical residency, intense but ultimately unsustainable as they both pursued demanding careers in different cities. They had parted amicably, promising to keep in touch, but gradually letting the connection fade as life pulled them in separate directions. He had never known, had never even suspected, that their brief time together had resulted in a child, a daughter, the woman lying before him now, whose life he had saved without knowing he had helped create it in the first place. "That's not possible," he said automatically, the denial rising from some deep place of self-preservation, even as his eyes traced the features of her face with new awareness. The shape of her eyes, his mother's eyes. The determined set of her jaw, unmistakably like looking in a mirror. How had he not seen it immediately? How had he performed hours of surgery on his own daughter without recognizing the connection between them? The clinical part of his mind supplied the answer. Extreme stress, the focus required by life-threatening injuries, the fact that he had never expected to encounter a child he didn't know existed. But another part of him, the part that had been uneasy since first seeing her, whispered that perhaps he had known on some level, had sensed the truth his conscious mind wasn't ready to accept. Grace watched the emotions play across his face, with the careful attention of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times in her imagination. "I have documentation," she said quietly, gesturing weakly toward the bag of personal belongings stored in the cabinet beside her bed. "Birth certificate, DNA test results comparing my profile to publicly available information about you, letters my mother wrote but never sent." She paused, swallowing with difficulty, the physical toll of her injuries evident in the pallor of her skin and the careful way she measured each breath. "I wasn't planning to ambush you like this. The accident changed my timeline. I was coming to the hospital to request a meeting, to approach this more formally, less dramatically." A ghost of a smile touched her lips, a familiar expression that sent another shock of recognition through James's system. The ICU suddenly felt too small, too public for the earthquake reshaping his understanding of his own life. Nurses moved efficiently around other patients. Monitors beeped their steady rhythms. Life continued its normal patterns while James stood frozen beside Grace's bed, unable to process the magnitude of what she was telling him. "We should discuss this later when you're stronger," he managed to say, his doctor's instincts taking over, providing a script when his personal faculties failed him. "You need to rest now. Your body has been through significant trauma." It was the right medical advice, but even as he said it, he recognized it for what it also was: a delay tactic, a desperate attempt to buy time before he had to fully face the implications of her presence in his life. Grace seemed to understand, nodding slightly, though disappointment flickered briefly across her features. "I've waited 25 years, she said softly. "I can wait a little longer for you to come to terms with this." The simple statement held no accusation, but it pierced James with the sharp edge of lost time. 25 years of his daughter's life that he had missed. Birthdays and first steps, and school graduations that had passed without his knowledge or participation. The magnitude of absence stretched between them like an abyss, impossible to cross in a single conversation. He found himself unable to maintain eye contact, his gaze dropping to the medical chart at the foot of her bed, seeking refuge in the familiar territory of clinical data and treatment protocols. "I'll check on you later," he promised, the words inadequate for the situation, but all he could manage as he retreated from the room. The hospital corridors offered no escape from the turmoil of his thoughts as James made his way to the doctor's lounge, seeking a moment of privacy to collect himself. Colleagues passed with nods of greeting, unaware that his entire understanding of his life had just been fundamentally altered. He had always prided himself on compartmentalizing effectively, keeping work separate from home, emotion separate from medical judgment. But now, those carefully maintained boundaries were dissolving, leaving him exposed to a flood of questions without clear answers. Had Rebecca known she was pregnant when they parted ways? Had she made a deliberate choice not to tell him? Or had circumstances beyond her control prevented her from reaching out? And what did Grace mean when she said his wife had raised her as her own? Catherine had never mentioned knowing Rebecca, let alone raising her child. The contradictions piled up, each one demanding attention he couldn't possibly give while still functioning in his professional capacity. Inside the empty lounge, James sank into a chair and allowed himself a rare moment of complete vulnerability, burying his face in his hands as if he could physically hold back the tide of implications washing over him. There was his son to consider. How would he react to the news of a half-sister he had never known? There was his own sense of identity as a father, which had been entirely defined by his relationship with his son and the shared grief over Catherine's death. There was the professional complication of having operated on his own daughter without knowing it, a situation that would raise eyebrows in the medical ethics committee if it became known. But beneath all these practical concerns lay something deeper and more painful, the realization that someone he had loved, whether Rebecca or Catherine or both, had kept this monumental secret from him for decades, had made decisions about his child without his knowledge or consent, had denied him the chance to know his own daughter. The cherry blossoms in the hospital courtyard drifted like pink snow across the pathways, creating a surreal beauty that contrasted sharply with the clinical environment inside. James sat beside Grace on a bench beneath the flowering trees, their third such meeting since her discharge from the ICU 4 days ago. The physical distance between them on the bench mirrored the emotional distance they were slowly attempting to bridge, close enough for conversation, but with careful space maintained, neither ready yet for the intimacy that their biological connection suggested should exist between them. Grace's recovery was progressing well. The surgical scars were healing cleanly, her strength returning incrementally with each passing day. She would be discharged soon, returning to her apartment across town, and James found himself surprisingly troubled by the thought of her leaving the hospital, as if the medical setting somehow provided a structured context for their tentative relationship that would be lost once she stepped back into her normal life. "My mother told me she met you during her nursing residency," Grace said, continuing the careful exchange of information that had characterized their interactions, each offering small pieces of their separate histories to construct a shared understanding. "She said you were the most focused person she'd ever met, completely dedicated to your patients, to becoming the best surgeon you could be." There was no judgment in her tone, only the quiet statement of fact, as it had been related to her. James nodded, memories of that time surfacing with surprising clarity, the punishing hours of residency, the desperate desire to prove himself, the way Rebecca had understood his drive without taking it personally when work claimed priority over their relationship. "She was right about that," he admitted. "I was single-minded back then. Medicine was my first commitment." Grace pulled her light jacket closer around her shoulders, protection against the spring breeze that carried both warmth and lingering winter chill. "She never said anything negative about you, not even when I was angry as a teenager and demanded to know why my biological father wasn't part of my life. She always insisted that you were a good man who simply didn't know about me." Her voice held the echo of those difficult conversations, the adolescent pain of feeling abandoned by a parent, even as her adult self had come to a more nuanced understanding. James felt each word like a physical touch, gentle but insistent, forcing him to confront realities he had never anticipated facing. "I would have wanted to know," he said quietly, the simple truth at the core of all the complex emotions swirling within him. "If she had told me, I would have wanted to be part of your life." The unasked questions hung between them. Would he have married Rebecca instead of Catherine? Would he have been a present father to Grace while still pursuing his surgical career? Would the three of them have formed a family different from, but no less real than the one he had built with Catherine and his son? There were no answers to these hypotheticals, only the reality they now faced. Strangers connected by blood, trying to determine what that connection meant after a lifetime of separation. "Tell me about her." "Your wife?" Grace requested, turning slightly on the bench to face him more directly. "My mother said she was remarkable, that she raised me as her own until I was 5, never treating me differently from her biological child." The statement confirmed what Grace had mentioned in the ICU, the puzzle piece that James had been struggling most to fit into his understanding of the past. The realization had come to him gradually over the past few days, as he pieced together the timeline from Grace's careful recounting of her childhood. Catherine had known Rebecca before he met either of them. They had been friends from nursing school. When Rebecca discovered she was pregnant and decided to raise the child on her own, Catherine had stepped in to help, becoming a co-parent of sorts during Grace's early years. Then Catherine had met James, never revealing that the child she sometimes cared for was actually his daughter from a previous relationship. The deception, if that was even the right word for such a complicated situation, had continued even after they married, with Catherine maintaining her relationship with Rebecca and Grace while keeping this connection separate from her life with James. It was a scenario so unlikely, so filled with coincidence and deliberate omission, that James might have disbelieved it entirely if not for the living proof sitting beside him with his mother's eyes and his own determined expression. "She was remarkable," James confirmed, his voice softening as memories of Catherine surfaced, her compassion, her quiet strength, the way she had faced her terminal diagnosis with grace that matched her stepdaughter's name. "She never spoke about knowing you or your mother, but it makes sense in retrospect. Catherine always had a capacity for love that seemed boundless. She would have seen helping raise you as simply the right thing to do, not something that required explanation or acknowledgement." He paused, a new thought occurring to him with startling clarity. "In fact, I think she was trying to tell me at the end. There were things she wanted to discuss that we never got to. Conversations interrupted by pain or medication or simply my inability to face losing her. I wonder now if this was one of the truths she wanted to share before it was too late." Grace nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears that mirrored the emotion James was struggling to contain. The revelation created a new connection between them, not just the direct line of biological parenthood, but the shared love they had both felt for Catherine, experienced from different perspectives but equally genuine. "She used to read to me," Grace said, her voice taking on the dreamy quality of childhood recollection. "When Mum was working night shifts, Catherine would stay over and read me stories about brave girls having adventures. I remember her voice more clearly than the stories themselves, gentle but never condescending, as if she believed I could understand everything important, even at 4 years old. The detail was small but vivid, a window into a relationship James had never known existed, a side of his wife he had glimpsed but never fully appreciated. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the courtyard, James found himself facing a decision point, not just about this conversation, but about the shape of his future. For years after Catherine's death, he had narrowed his focus to 2 channels, his surgical practice and raising his son. Everything else had been carefully excluded, deemed unnecessary complexity in an already challenging life. Now Grace's presence demanded expansion, a widening of his concept of family and responsibility that was both terrifying and, he was surprised to realize, quietly exhilarating. "Would you like to meet your brother?" he asked, the question emerging before he had fully considered its implications. "Not immediately. He's away at college until next month, but when he's home for summer break. If you're comfortable with that idea." The offer represented more than just a family introduction. It was an acknowledgement that he wanted Grace in his life going forward, wanted to build something new from the fragments of truth they were piecing together. Grace's smile transformed her face, erasing the last traces of patient vulnerability and revealing the vibrant personality that existed beyond her medical condition. "I'd like that very much," she said, the simple acceptance containing layers of meaning that both of them understood without needing to articulate. There would be challenges ahead, explanations to his son, navigating the boundaries of their new relationship, integrating Grace into a family structure that had been defined without her for decades. Nothing about this process would be simple or straightforward. But as they sat together watching the cherry blossoms drift down in the gentle spring breeze, James felt something he had not experienced since Catherine's death. The tentative unfurling of hope, the sense that family could be not just what you're born into or what you build deliberately, but also what you discover unexpectedly and choose to embrace, despite all the complications and uncertainties that choice entails.